The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim is directed by Kinji Kamiyama and is a prequel to the Lord of the Rings franchise that was the Lord of the Rings films that was directed by Peter Jackson. And in this story, it deals with the early days of Rohan, where you have the king of Rohan and also the daughter named Hera, who are pretty much trying to defend their land from a war that breaks out after. Not going to go into too much detail, but essentially it deals with something that involves where a childhood friend of Hera's ends up going to war after plotting a revenge, and there's more to it than that, but I'm trying to leave it out for spoilers' sake. But essentially, it's very straightforward like that. And along the way, they have to pretty much get all the people involved to go to what would eventually be known as Helm's Deep later on in the Lord of the Rings lore. Now, here's some backstory. Now, growing up, I actually will admit that Lord of the Rings has actually been one of my favorite fantasy franchises of all time, along with Harry Potter. When the first Lord of the Rings movie came out in 2001 with the Fellowship of the Ring, it really changed the landscape what we saw with fantasy films, because that also came out the same year as Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, depending on where you live at. And it basically sparked the way of seeing new fantasy epics the way that we haven't seen before, or basically bringing back that approach where you're able to adapt a book series into something a lot more like very memorable, but also very imaginative and everything. And the trilogy to this day still holds as one of my all-time favorite films. And it definitely proved that it basically put Peter Jackson on the map in the mainstream. Even though he had directed some really good movies before, like The Frighteners, and also his other early works like Dead Alive and stuff. But Lord of the Rings is definitely what made him into a household name. And with those movies, it really seemed like they wanted to keep it going for a while with not only just adapting the original trilogy, but also that from J.R.R. Tolkien. But also, when they were going to do the Hobbit series, Jackson came back to do that after Guillermo del Toro was originally going to be involved with it, and then he had to step down. And given for what they are, I know people don't really care too much for the Hobbit films, but I actually really enjoyed the Hobbit trilogy despite its issues and stuff. And while they don't capture the same vibe as the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, I still think that they still work in their own right, and definitely doing some good little tie-ins and stuff. And the great way of setting up a lot of great things with all the characters and everything. For the most part, even though there is some flaws I see that fans have with it. Now, I myself haven't really read much of the books by J.R.R. Tolkien and everything, so I might not be familiar with a lot of how the stories go in a lot of these, in the lore of it. But from what I remember when I was a kid, I actually did remember reading the first Lord of the Rings book, Fellowship. Like maybe I don't know if I ever finished it or anything, but I've gotten at least wanting to try to at least read the book someday, especially the Hobbit and all the other stories of Tolkien, and being able to really see how the Middle Earth and everything is expanded on. And for it actually, there's been talk for a while if that supposedly Jackson was going to come back and possibly do another one to do something else. And there was this kind of thing going on for a while where we were seeing that because there were rights issues, that they were trying to basically keep the rights to the franchise, the studio involved, New Line Cinema. This anime film was essentially created to keep the rights for that going, because since it's been 10 years since the last movie, since the last actual theatrical film, in this case, The Battle of the Five Armies, it pretty much got wind that New Line Cinema was making this one to solely keep the rights to the franchise, and you can definitely tell it shows, but I'll get into that. But on top of that, there were also news that broke out that, I don't know if he's directing, but Peter Jackson is involved with the next film that they're doing, which will be called The Hunt for Gollum, which I am curious about. But it also does make me kind of wondering where that's really going to go, especially if it's going to be another prequel and stuff. Because, I mean, there's only really so much stories you can tell, especially since they have to go off the source material that they're able to use and everything, based off of what Tolkien's work. So, going into this one, I had expectations just kind of in the minimum. Like, I was looking forward to it because I am a really good Lord of the Rings fan. And I even have seen the first season of the Lord of the Rings TV show, Rings of Power. I just thought it was a decent first season. I haven't seen the second one, but I still need to really digest with that, seeing the second season and everything. But so I'm always game for whatever new approach they have with the Lord of the Rings franchise, especially with any kind of video games and stuff. But going to this one, because I'm also a big anime fan, I actually really like the way that they were trying to put in that kind of style and everything. And so after upon seeing it, I can say that this movie was decent. It certainly has its issues that really hold it back, and it's certainly one that you can definitely tell this one was solely made to pretty much keep the rights to the franchise. But on an overall kind of vibe, it still was a decent and good, it has a good nostalgia to it, especially the stuff that you've seen from some of the other Lord of the Rings films and everything. And there's at least merit to it, but it does leave a lot to be desired. And so to get my pros out of the way, I thought the voice cast in this were pretty good, especially Brian Cox as the king. And also the girl that plays Hera in this. I thought they did a tremendous job. And also, I don't know if this is just me, but I actually do like the way that the characters are able to emote with the way that the voice acting goes in this, because not only do you hear a lot of the grunts and a lot of the ways they're, you actually hear like their movements and stuff like that, which I thought was really a nice touch, especially with it giving that kind of more grounded approach that I don't really see too often in anime. And that can be a mixed kind of bag as far as the animation itself in some scenes, because the animation itself looks very gorgeous, especially when you get to see the opening scene where it looks like it's on a map and everything, and like you see in the other, like in the live action Lord of the Rings films, and being able to see a lot of the locations that are familiar, like Rohan, Helm's Deep, and even some other areas that are pretty neat. Looks very crisp and beautiful looking. Especially the scenes that take place in the snow. I thought that was a really nice touch, and definitely gives you the kind of Christmas setting since the movie's in December and everything. And so that was great. And then the familiar score was also great too, hearing some classic themes that you hear from the movies, like the Rohan, the soundtrack from Rohan, and then also the Lord of the Rings theme, the opening theme and stuff like that. That was great. And then the nostalgia is definitely there with a lot of stuff that they actually set up and actually reference, because they also get the actress that played I believe it was, if her name was correctly, Eowyn, from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, to come back to do narration of it. And she does a great job being able to really tell us a lot of the parallels that pretty much, because the movie is basically doing like a parallels that happen between her and her father, and also in the live action, but also you can see the similarities that go on with Hera and her father in a lot of ways, because of how she's not really wanting to be taking the crown or anything, or really wanting to join the royalty. She just wants to do what's best for her family and all that. And I really love the dynamic that it takes with the king and the daughter, and the way that it really builds on that, and a lot of the stuff that they can see with the people that are struggling and everything, especially with everything that's been happening with the war that breaks out. And so that was really great, and a lot of the cool stuff they set up later on that I thought was really interesting. I'm not going to spoil, but let's just say it gets into some pretty cool, it gets into a fantastical elements that I got to give it credit for in that regard, because it definitely makes you feel more of the fantasy elements that they're kind of going more closer with. And on top of that, I will say the battle scenes in this are really epic, and it really gets you that vibe like you've seen familiar with the Lord of the Rings films, and then seeing the like other stuff that they actually tie into later on in the series as well. And there's actually then it was great, and then there's a big cameo that I won't reveal, but it was really interesting how they were able to really get that. I was like, wow, I did not expect that happening for this movie, but they did a great job with that. And then there's some other things I could go into detail, but this is kind of also where I fall into more of my cons. And what does bring the movie down back, unfortunately, is that the movie itself does feel like it's just more of a straightforward revenge story, and just like a full-on war film, where you have the king and Hera pretty much having to defend everything from this army that takes place. And honestly, it really feels like it leaves a lot more to actually set up, because this whole gimmick thing pretty much starts only because this childhood friend of Hera just is so obsessed with her that he pretty much becomes like a very generic villain, and he's got to be one of the most, it's got to be the most laziest writing that I've seen pretty much in the entire franchise, Lord of the Rings, where it's all about just him obsessed with power and stuff, and it comes to a point where he doesn't even listen to his own general on anything that he does, and it just makes you wonder, like, why is this guy even running this army? It's just all very standard stuff that I feel very questioned about, and he makes a lot of dumb decisions even for a leader. I thought Wolf just was one of the most least interesting characters of the entire franchise for me, and there was nothing really about him that really stuck out in a good way. And I didn't really. Now, if we probably would have gave him some more nuance to maybe show more about what he was when he was in his childhood and everything, that probably could have at least explained more of his character, or at least showed some more things that they could have really fleshed his character out with. But they don't really do much anything other than him just completely obsessed and then going double crossing people and all kinds of stuff, and just really not. It just really makes me, it's. I know it's supposed to be a character that you love to hate, but it just gets it to where it's very not interesting, and it just doesn't really. I don't really capture that vibe with him as a menacing villain, And then on top of that, the other thing I have to admit too is that the story itself, the way that it goes into this kind of very simplified war, it almost seems like the whole Lord of the Rings kind of aspect takes more of a backseat, to where we don't really get into a lot of the fantastical elements that we've come to see with Middle Earth. because this is a very straightforward war film where you're seeing like constantly just battles taking place and stuff, and other than the part we get down in the middle and then some things that kind of lead into the end, and I just feel like this movie is just one of those where it's just more of a side plot. It's a more of a whole side movie that really feels like it's separate from what we see with the other films. That even The Hobbit and other films that The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings films where they blend in a lot of the whole fantastical elements and all that, because there's really nothing like that in here. Well, on top of that, it does feel like there's some other characters in the story that seem like they don't really get much to really work with in the actual that much, other than getting like some quick, payoffs that happen. But I just really feel like there wasn't really much merit to it because, like for example, there's a stuff that's going on with Wolf's right hand general, his general that's commanding the army and stuff, and it feels like there's more to this guy that we could have really explored with to really build this really big payoff that happens. And then on top of this other stuff that happens with Harrow's brother that has a plot point later on, and it just feels like some of these ones get really sidelined and not really taking much focus. And when it comes back, it's like I was supposed to feel something, and there is something that plays pretty big with it, and I see where they were going, but it feels like it could have been a lot more. Really could have struck me a lot better the way they played it out with. You know what I mean? That, and also I feel like it's one of those where the pacing can be pretty slow pace. It can be very slow at times, where once we get into about the middle, it kind of takes more of a lot of stuff to really get into. Like, because most of it is just them kind of waiting around to try to figure out like what their next plan is to try to defend. And it kind of rinses and repeats itself with a lot of the same stuff we see with Wolf not listening to anybody and was not listening to his general and stuff like that. It kind of rinses and repeats a lot with that. And then on top of that, we also get into some other stuff that involves where the animation can look really good, but at the beginning it did take me a while to get into because it did feel like it was very choppy at times, where when the characters move, they are moving very slowly, and I think as the movie went along, I got used to it because I think that was intentional for them to try to make it that more grounded type of approach, because it is good to see 2D animation like that, especially in that anime style. And I also felt like the climax, the way it plays out with our big epic fight, like that towards the end, felt a little too rushed at times. That, and also even when we get to like closer to, there is some stuff that's kind of short-lived when we get into the kind of sort of fantastical element like I mentioned earlier, because even that's kind of short-lived, and so I wish they could have went more with it, but it does work in the context of the story, but I just wish we could have seen a lot more evolved with it and everything. There's more I can go into detail, but that's really the gist of it. I did overall still liked what the movie does with some things. It just feels like it could have been a whole lot better. But I still would still include this at least as part of the collection and everything. And so with that, I'm going to give the movie just a high average Joe on the Film Freaks meter. So for those of you who have also seen The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, sorry if I can't pronounce it right, and the other films, the Lord of the Rings franchise, let me know in the comments what you thought about it. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next review. I'll see you later.